Welcome to the GSMC Pets Podcast, the show that caters to pet lovers of all kinds. We'll talk about pets on social media, pets doing amazing things, and how to take care of the pets in your life. Whether your pet is a dog, a cat, a llama, hamster, reptile, or something more exotic, you'll find educational and entertaining information on the GSMC Pets Podcast.
Hello, and thank you all once again for tuning in to the GSMC Pets Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex Fletes. So, on the GSMC Pets Podcast, we love talking about animals. All types of animals, pets, wild, not so wild, friendly, not so friendly. But one type of pet we don't really get to talk about very often, or rather that I like to get to talk about but don't get the chance to, are fantastical animals. Animals that delve into the world of fiction, that have some real-world inspiration, that are just fascinating, and honestly would be some really awesome pets. So, with that being said, you know me. I'm a bit of a nerdy guy, and I love to really talk about things that make me excited in fiction and media. And since today just feels like a special day to me, I thought I would discuss some of my favorite fictional pets and creatures and why they're fascinating, some of their real-world inspirations, and just kind of have a nice discussion today. And what better way to start things off than a very fun, very lovable creature from a very popular book-to-movie franchise. If you know it, you love it. The flying horse eagle thing, a hippogriff by the name of Buckbeak, and specifically hippogriffs as a whole. Now, I'm saying the word hippogriff, and if you've seen Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, you've probably seen this creature a lot. So, quickly, I'm going to go over what a hippogriff is. By Greek mythology, a hippogriff in description is a horse-like creature with feathers that has wings and a bird-like head. Now, the bird head itself is more eagle-like. Now, why this is interesting to me is that the word hippogriff actually does come from two Greek words, mainly coming from the word hippos, meaning horse, and griffin, or griff, or griffus, which, is another mythical creature. Now, what is the difference between a hippogriff and a griffin and such? Well, there are some differences, mainly being that a hippogriff, as I explained already, is a horse-like creature with a bird or an eagle's head and wings, whereas a griffin is more of a creature that has a lion's body with a bird's head, or sometimes other types of heads as well, and sometimes it might have a tail, like with a snake on it, but it also has wings as well. Now, the difference also being is that hippogriffs seem to be more majestic and fantastical creatures, whereas griffins seem to be more like, aggressive protectors. So that could be also a different way to look at things as well. Now, talking about the actual character Buckbeak, who was very adorable, and why I find it to be so fascinating, it's one of the few times that hippogriffs are actually used in media for more than just a background observation. They seem to have made a bit of a, the word would be a bit of a impact in the most recent years, in fiction. A lot of the basic creatures like dragons and, even griffins have sort of taken a back seat to some of these more obscure creatures, which I'm actually pretty excited about. Now, hippogriffs themselves are kind of an anomaly, but then again, when you're dealing with fantastical creatures, what do you expect? So when it comes to hippogriffs, first off, I guess the pairing of a horse and a bird really don't work well. in a logical sense, but then again, logic's kind of thrown out the window here. But the The reason why I find hippogriffs also kind of fascinating is that they provide a neutral, if not a positive light for protagonist characters. Now, I'm also a bit of a literary or a film buff as well, so I kind of have a little thing to say here, but certain creatures are going to be provided to a hero or a character in a positive light to reinforce that they are a positive character. So, our main character wouldn't be riding a giant snake, a giant venomous snake in a movie or a TV show as their traveling companion unless there's something interesting about that character. Instead, our main character rides something pretty neutral, majestic, heroic, so a hippogriff or a flying horse does make sense for our main character. And that's kind of an interesting way to kind of look at it. I mean, in fiction, it's kind of like, hey, our main character needs to get from point A to point B. How do we get them there? Let's fly them there. How do we fly them there? Giant bird? No, I don't like that. Dragon? He's not. Dragon's kind of evil, so let's not put him on an evil dragon. Well, what about a horse? Okay, that can fly, alright, but also has the head of an eagle, so it makes sense why it can fly. Love it. But hippogriffs are still fascinating creatures to me. They have different mythologies, a lot of it just based out of Greek mythology as well. They seem to be sort of based on an old poem, a piece of fiction. They have a lot more to them that I'm not really going to go into depth because I could actually be here for a long time talking about them if I wanted to go into lore. But what they do seem to be a matter of symbolism, seems to be sort of a symbol of just straight up divine creation, but also, I guess, a mixture of love and peace, which kind of makes sense. And I myself am also just fascinated by creatures of mythology and lore. But I'm also really fascinated by things like theme parks, and of course with there being a Harry Potter world out in Universal Studios Florida, they have a Flight of the Hippogriff ride, which is really fun. I've actually been on it, and they have a really awesome animatronic of Buckbeak from the movie, and it really kind of gives you more of a perspective of what this kind of creature would be like in real life, which is definitely something you should check out if you get the chance in any time in the future. On top of that, there have also been some interesting situations of people making hoaxes of creatures like this. Apparently out in 1904, some tricksters use a monster to try to sort of mess with people around there. And then, of course, there was also, back in 1999, people also doing the same thing, saying around the lakes and shores that there was a monster. But that's just sort of how traditions and fun hoaxes go. No idea really why, I guess more or less just to have a prank. On top of that, of course, as you know, the Harry Potter series has had a prominent character, Buckbeak, being a hippogriff, who played a major role in Harry Potter and the Prison of Azkaban. And it was nice that they had a animal caretaker taking care of such a interesting creature, and probably why he's one of my favorite characters. Along with that, we also have Dungeons and Dragons, obviously one of the more fantastical fantasy type of games out there to really incorporate a lot of mythical creatures, and definitely hippogriffs are not an exception. Except they seem to have more of a sort of beastly appearance as well, closer to griffins and pegasi as well. And then, of course, if you also have any children or any young ones, the My Little Pony series from most recent years actually did incorporate hippogriffs as well, which was actually something pretty fascinating that they actually decided to go into more of a fantasy lore setting after a while instead of just ponies, unicorns, and pegasi. So, fiction really has embraced these kind of creatures. I think in the real world they would be interesting. I mean, I myself would definitely love to see a real hippogriff. But the closest I'll probably get is going to Universal Studios. But the idea is pretty fascinating. It's not scientifically sound, but it is pretty interesting. And that's just sort of the fun about fiction and the characters we sort of invest ourselves in. Just seeing how unique they can be and the kind of world we can have. Because, without fiction, we wouldn't really have enough creativity to inspire, things like this. But these magical creatures are still good. They're still great. Buckbeak was definitely an adorable animal companion in the movie he was presented in. And it really made me feel something for this fictional creature, and kind of makes me want to, go ride a horse or a giant bird if I was able to. But with that being said, we're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk more about these amazing fantastical beasts and where they come from and all the amazing things they're able to do on the Pets Podcast. So please stay tuned, and we'll be right back.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
And we are back once again. I'm so glad you guys decided to stick around. We have a lot of interesting, fantastical animals to talk about today, fantasy pets, and the amazing things they're able to accomplish, and some interesting facts to real-world relations about them. Now, we've been talking about fantasy animals today, and it's definitely a topic that I think is a lot of fun. We just previously talked about hippogriffs, relating back to the Harry Potter series and some of the real-world inspirations from them. But there are other animals that have a lot more real-world inspiration that you may not know about, and that makes them even more fascinating of creatures when taking the time to learn more about them. Now, some are still incredibly fantastical animals that are only pumped up in their fantasy by things like media, books, and such. But there is actually one animal that gets a lot of praise in media that is actually very solid to reality and not as fantasized as you may believe. And that creature is a direwolf. Now, you may ask, what's a direwolf? Well, if you've watched Game of Thrones, it's a big wolf. It's a very big wolf. In some cases, they try to make them really, really big, probably bigger than a bear. But in reality, a direwolf was probably about the size of, I'd say, looking at a lot of references, a direwolf probably fell somewhere around bigger than a Great Dane. Probably bigger than a Great Dane, just under the size of a horse. They were incredibly large. Little children can easily probably ride them, but as an adult, it would be more or less a little too small, but still very large for a wolf. In reality, anyways. Now, that's also without having enough full references to have a variety, but they were indeed real creatures. And it's fascinating simply because direwolves were just part of the other larger creatures that existed around the time that made them so much more fascinating. Simply being that direwolves weren't simply exclusive to some fantastical magical land. Now, in, say, Game of Thrones, they do have bigger animals, direwolves and such. They don't often directly call them direwolves, but they are large wolves. You definitely know the one I'm talking about. And they are fascinating because they do, in a sense, exist, but they were just kind of big dogs, which thankfully that show does get it right. A lot of other series, a lot more magical series, do tend to add some more magical elements into them as well, when in reality these were just incredibly very big creatures. I'd say if we're looking at references and size, these creatures, if they stood up on all fours, they would be actually tall. If they stood up on two legs, they would actually probably be about as tall as a human. which is very impressive, and very few animals, dogs actually get to that size. It's very impressive, honestly. But a lot of time they're seen as protectors, as sort of like magical gatekeepers, sometimes as like wild animals that have just like sort of roamed and plagued the land. They're very interesting creatures regardless. But what's interesting about these creatures, though, is that, like I said, they were still creatures relative to other things that existed at the time. Mammoths, giant sloths, which still fascinates me that there's a giant sloth out there, or that there was. And what's also really fascinating about these creatures is that they were not omnivores or carnivores or herbivores. They were something called let me see if I got this term right, a mega herbivore. Well, no, my mistake. They were preying on mega herbivores. So creatures that were herbivores but were, quote, bigger. They were large creatures. And there's a lot of other factoids to why these kind of creatures didn't stick around. My 2 cents on the matter is simply that being such a bigger creature, mega herbivores and stuff like that, there weren't always enough resources to go around. So, bigger creatures, due to both an extinction event and just size, didn't last a long time. They were such bigger creatures, extinction event happens, and large creatures were easily able to get caught in the blasts or get caught in the most of it, whereas smaller creatures made it through unscathed because they were easier to hide. It's pretty interesting and pretty simple when you think about it, just kind of how things work. But dire wolves, in a lot of media, say, again, going back to Game of Thrones, even Dungeons and Dragons, even in some Greek mythology as well, and I think Norse mythology, large wolves, were just simply seen as large creatures. There are such things as dire bears and even, to an extent, dire rats, which are just apparently large, aggressive creatures you do not want to get on their bad side of. I find them to be interesting when it comes to a fantasy setting, but the fact that this is one of the few creatures that had a real-world application, had a real-world relation, is pretty interesting to me. It's not very often you see something like that happen, or that it has relatively a one-to-one sort of comparison to it. It's interesting. I mean, we could say that, Komodo dragons for a while were considered fantastical creatures because they were, quote, dragons, but in reality they were very large lizards. They are incredibly dangerous to an extent, and they were considered not real, extinct, or made up, but they are indeed real creatures. So there's a lot of different things that could have really adapted to the creatures dying out. Some people say it was carbon radiation. Some people say it had something to do with a megafauna, fungal extinction. There's a lot of different things that just seem to attribute to it, along with things like climate change and such. But I don't know if we'll ever 100% know, or if anything like this could ever happen. But if you've seen big enough dogs, there still are some pretty big dogs out there. And it's safe to say that they may not be dire wolves, but I think, if anything, the fact that some of these animals can get as big as they do does say that it's possible, and that definitely there is a bit of a mystery and fantasy to the idea of large animals. And this also begs the question, was Clifford the Big Red Dog a dire wolf? But it still is interesting. There were mega animals at the time, and I'm sure that if they were still around, these would be creatures that we would definitely have around, that we'd definitely be watching out for. In a lot of fantasy, these creatures are huge. Like, you see their eyes peering through the trees, and you see their fangs as big as or as thick as a tree stump. It's pretty amazing when you actually take a look at the fantasy of it. Sometimes these creatures are seen as good, protective, benevolent guardians. Sometimes they're seen as just mindless animals. It really is interesting depending on the interpretation. But dire wolves are one of the few actual creatures that had real world application, that had real world long-standing in it. And it's interesting that a lot of people don't really know about that. And I would definitely recommend taking some time to look those up because they are cool. They are really cool. Also, look up the mega sloth, the giant sloth, because that blows my mind. There was a giant sloth. I've held a sloth, and they are just fuzzy slowpokes, but a giant sloth still boggles me. It's amazing. Giant animals are cool. They are really cool. But with that being said, we're about to go on another quick break, and when we do come back, we have some more fantastical, mythical, interesting animals to talk about, the amazing things they're able to do, and just how amazing they could be, even if they are or aren't giant. But until that, we'll be right back. Please stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. Thank you guys for sticking around today. I'm kind of getting to bring my full nerd out today as I talk about magical pets, cool, amazing pets and their fantastical abilities, and the real-world applications of them and inspirations. So I just spent the last few minutes talking about hippogriffs and definitely talking about some dire wolves and how amazing it is how these are actually based off of, and in some cases, actually real creatures. Now, of course, just because they're magical creatures doesn't mean that there aren't real-world inspirations, that there isn't something that comes from somewhere, with the exception of dire wolves that actually do have real-world applications and real-world relatives. But today I'm also talking about another very common, very powerful, very amazing magical animal that typically gets put as a pet in most types of media. From the hit movie trilogy series to a variety of Disney series, to just about anywhere you can think of. Probably the most sought-after magical pet would be the amazing, the scaly, the large, the small, the impressive, the friendly, the ever-famous fire-breathing dragon. Now, dragons are famous throughout history, throughout mythology, from the Middle Ages to many types of series and fiction, and just about everywhere. Now, just because dragons are known as pets, and I say they're pets in the sense that some characters get to have a dragon as a pet, some characters fight dragons as their final conqueror, and in some cases, dragons aren't really the same type of dragons we expect. But what makes dragons so special and unique? Well, let's kind of break down a dragon just for a minute here. So they are usually depicted as large, scaly lizards, typically with wings, and there are actually different varieties of this, but typically with wings or has the ability to fly, and usually has the ability to breathe fire. That's pretty much the majority of what a dragon is. Why is this so cool? Well, aside from being a large lizard that can fly, it then gains the ability to breathe fire, and a lot of it. So we look at this creature and just thinking of some of the most famous kind of pets, the How to Train Your Dragon movies, which sort of really glamorized dragon, having a dragon as a pet, as a friend, and actually I really enjoy those movies for really sort of not only making dragons both more of a pet animal, but like really treating them as animals and actually showing that they need proper care, which is something I really did appreciate for those movies. Showing that they needed special care, diets, that sometimes they need exercises and enrichment, a lot of things that I usually talk about, which is why I actually really do love those movies, because they sort of bring that aspect, especially the knowledge of different types of dragons, their physiology, and a lot of things they do, which was really cool to me. But then on the other spectrum of things, sometimes they're just seen as big creatures that sort of just live and do as you say if you gain their respect. That can be a case for animals, but they also kind of take away some of the more interesting aspects of dragons, being the physiology. People want to think that dragons are fascinating simply because, whoa, if I had a big dragon, then I'd have a big dragon. But people don't realize what's interesting about dragons is that they're kind of anomalies. They are, by all means, biological anomalies. A lizard that can fly, that's already cool. But then it also can breathe fire, that's cool. And in some cases it does other things too, which I'll get into in a minute. But people find them as interesting. And in most cases, I mean, dragons really just kind of come out of literature as well. One of the earliest cases being the Chronicles of Beowulf, where a dragon was kind of the creature that he had to slay. It was one of his challenges, and it just sort of took off from there. Now, there are a bunch of other types of dragons as well, if you look at things such as, different cultures, a Chinese dragon and a European dragon are two completely different beasts. And each have different significance as well, whereas a Chinese dragon might have more of a place of being a guardian or a keeper of wisdom. A European dragon is usually seen as a big monster that guards something like a princess in a tower or a bunch of treasure, usually looking more like a big dinosaur, which is pretty interesting. And let's kind of talk about those major differences, being that a European dragon is probably what we as fiction consumers usually get to see. Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, a lot of these dragons are European based, so they have a lot more of a physical body, big claws, long necks, wings, and breathe fire. It seems terrifying, but it's kind of awesome. But at the same time, it's because they're considered monsters. Whereas Chinese dragons are more mystical. On some occasions they breathe fire, but in other times they just simply are mystical guardians, who've lived a long time, who protect certain areas, virtues, and are seen more or less as a symbol of power or knowledge, which is definitely different considering how different they are as species. And then we also kind of see other things too, again, let's look at say a very famous dragon, Mushu from Mulan. Well, not really a pet, more of a companion. Small, pocket-sized dragon, talks wisecracking, but it's not a winged dragon. He doesn't really breathe much fire. And the idea simply being is that he's a small dragon who's supposed to give guidance, as opposed to being a fire-breathing monster who can wreck anything in his path. But then we look at, let's go back to How to Train Your Dragon for a minute there, and how these dragons are considered more or less pets and friends, but most of them breathe fire, have wings, big claws, and if you look at them, look a lot more like dinosaurs. That's more of the European concept of dragons, which also does make sense since How to Train Your Dragon takes place in more Norse mythology anyway. But it's not really, neither one has a lot of legitimacy, since dragons seem to completely have emerged from fiction regardless. However, if we look at the closest thing we might have being the bearded dragons and the Komodo dragons, the only two things we really call dragons, neither one really have those descriptions of being a dragon. A Komodo dragon looks a lot like a sort of skinny, more fit alligator with a lizard's face, and a bearded dragon just kind of looks like a big lizard with some extra little spines on it, which they are both very, very interesting creatures in themselves with their own special properties. But dragons, sort of being long, serpentine, fire-breathing, they're interesting in concept because, again, they are biological abnormalities. They're definitely cool, too. I mean, it would be awesome to get to ride on the back of a dragon, and just kind of, have fun, maybe breathe some fire on stuff, things like that. But when it comes to real-world applications, the closest we're going to get are just big reptiles. To this date, I don't think there are any animals that are possibly even close to having the ability to breathe fire. There are some, and I mean some very interesting cases of this. Main case being a salamander, which a lot of Eastern beliefs are that a salamander was born of fire, when in reality salamanders are sort of like lizards that lived near the ashes of made fires, and when people moved it, they'd sort of scurry out of the fire because they liked the warmth. And people believe they were just born of the fire and ash, and that's sort of how salamanders, and I guess maybe even dragons, sort of kind of came from, which is kind of interesting how just a funny coincidence or a funny little habit of a lizard could start a rumor like that as well. But that's just kind of how things roll, and it just kind of makes funny how nature and man sort of react that way. But with that being said, we're going to go on another quick break, and when we come back, we have some more interesting animals to talk about. Some very interesting animals you probably didn't even know had mythical properties. But until then, please stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Is weird, odd, strange, or just plain bizarre is really your cup of tea? Then the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast will give you that fix. Can't believe it? Well, listen for yourself as we deliver the strangest news you definitely won't find on CNN or Fox. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast.
We're back again. Thanks for sticking around today. We're talking about fantastical, mythical pets and some of the interesting things they're able to do today. We have talked about the amazing world of Harry Potter and its amazing mythical animals. We've talked about hippogriffs. We've talked today about dragons. And we've also talked about the real-world direwolves and how media has portrayed them nowadays. But I want to talk about probably one of my favorite, and I mean favorite, mythical animals provided by media. And this animal is a little bit different because it's actually a mixture of animals, but it has really unique abilities, and it's definitely lovable nonetheless. So if in the mid-2000s you had the pleasure of enjoying the amazingly created animated series Avatar: The Last Airbender, then you probably saw this creature floating in the sky and just being an all-around goofball, fluffy animal, and that's a sky bison. Now, why am I talking about a sky bison, a made-up creature for a TV series? Because it's a very amazing pet that has some pretty interesting influences, and it just seems like a really great topic to talk about how amazingly unassuming animals could be interpreted. So a sky bison. So a bison itself is kind of like an ox or a bull. It's sort of like a big cow with horns. It's very similar. It's a lot bulkier. It's not as fast, but it's still pretty powerful. Now, what's a sky bison? Well, a sky bison is a made-up creature for the world of Avatar: The Last Airbender. And this creature is loved by the air nomads of the series. And these creatures are called sky bison because despite the fact that these creatures look like they have absolutely no aerodynamic feats whatsoever, due to their own innate abilities of sort of using air currents, they are able to actually take flight. So these creatures themselves have an interesting design. When you look at them, they just kind of look like big, fluffy cows, kind of. And they're kind of round. They have a lot of white fluff, which actually benefits them tremendously, which I'll explain why in a minute. But they also have 6 legs, and they also have big, flat, almost beaver tails. Why does this work, per se? Well, the design of the character, specifically the curvature of its body and the big, flat tail, actually are designed from, and get this, they were actually derived from sea manatees in the conceptual stage of the series. So, when you look at the design, how they fly, a lot of the ways they move, it actually makes sense why their design works and why they're able to fly. Now, the flying is a little bit of a stretch, but it's actually interesting that they don't simply just fly by magically lifting, but rather the sort of motion of the tail, the big sort of flap they give off before they fly, propels them into the air, and then they're able to sort of catch the wind and glide under it. So they're flying, but they're also using the air to sort of guide them around as though they were in water. It's really interesting how they pulled that influence for the character. What's also really interesting is that they actually had early concept of the series, and the characters actually did look more like manatees. But the interesting part of this is that actually how these made-up characters actually did feed into the lore of the show itself, and how the sky bison in the series actually influenced the airbenders of the series and taught them how to airbend, or at least helped them influence the airbending style. So take that as you will when it comes to fictional characters, but how about when it comes to real-world influences as well? Well, we have creatures that have been made in a fantasy mythological setting in our own world, as we previously talked when it came to things like dragons and hippogriffs. However, these things have also not only influenced other media, but have also influenced, say, the way we view things, the way that we can interpret a lot of things we do in the real world, and even influence some things like technology, and have influenced literature as a whole as well. Simply because someone came up with an interesting concept and it sort of stuck through mythology. And that's sort of just how things kind of fluctuate. A myth, a legend, a story, a hearsay can sometimes turn and breed its own legends and stories and real world spins to eventually make something that might stick, that people take to. And it's really fascinating. Now, the air bison are definitely fascinating in their own right, especially with the main character's air bison being Appa, a very goofy, lovable, big, fluffy guy. And apparently, which is kind of interesting about sky bison, is that apparently they were also very similar to actual hunted buffalo and bison in the real world, that they actually decided that, it was a nice parallel that in the real world they're actually almost hunted to extinction. And it's very interesting. A lot of things about this show that they decided to sort of incorporate with these creatures really does help mimic a lot of real world inspiration. Now, what's interesting to me about characters like this in the series, especially with the Avatar series, is that they actually decide to mesh around 2 different characters, or rather 2 different animal types, to make a new different character. So the only animal I can think of in the real world that has this weird aspect of being almost 2 animals in one or more is the platypus. Now, in this series, they take a lot of, like, two different animals and mix them together, like turtles and ducks, making turtle ducks. Sometimes there are things like a mole and a wolf, or a bat and a wolf. They mix together things so frequently that in the series, whenever there is a just straight up normal animal, it's weird. A normal animal. I think one of the more interesting characters as well is also the sort of flying lemur that they have. It's just such as the main character's other pet being Momo, a flying lemur, which is kind of like a lemur with bat wings. It's interesting because these characters and these animals don't make a lot of sense. They wouldn't make a lot of sense in the real world, but the way that they're made does sort of mesh together in a natural sense that does sort of make some accuracy if they were real, which is what I appreciate about the show, is that they really did take the time to actually adapt animals and hybrids into the world and actually have some real world limitations behind them. If we took, say, in the show they had a platypus bear, and to the fact that the platypus bear actually laid an egg. Platypi actually do lay eggs. You also have things to wonder, such as, is it possible that some of these creatures could exist? Could there be a flying monkey or a flying lemur? Could there be mixed and hybrids of animals? Let's hope that we don't find out through extensive means. But these fantastical animals do provide some interesting aspects whenever you look at the show. So if you haven't actually seen Avatar: The Last Airbender, please watch it, if only for the animals. If you don't care for the fantasy element, the animals are very fascinating and always offer some interesting variety. But the sky bison are definitely interesting with how deep the lore of them go, with what they're capable of doing, with how much personality they have, that I really do enjoy these creatures, and they're definitely one of my favorite fantastical fantasy animals. The hippogriff may be odd to me when it comes to real world application and potential to be aerodynamic, but at least the sky bison, being as outrageous as it can be, makes a lick of sense to me and just feels like it would be something I would want to spend time with. It's such a fascinating creature. And the show is filled with fascinating creatures. But with that being said, we're going to take another quick break. But when we come back, we have a few more animals to talk about and some more interesting fantasy topics as well. So please, stay tuned. We'll be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Thanks once again for sticking around today, guys. I'm so glad you're here. We're talking about fantastical, mythical, fantasy animal pets and the amazing things they're able to do today. So I've talked about dragons, hippogriffs, I've talked about dire wolves, and I've also just talked about the amazing sky bison from Avatar: Last Airbender. But there's one creature that I think has amazing, very fantastical abilities that a lot of people don't realize are there. Their untapped potential. These animals are fascinating in their own right. They have a lot of interesting things going on for them, and that would be the elusive, the cunning, the masterful weasel. Now you may think, a weasel, those are real, and they are little stringy noodles. Yes, that's true. Weasels are pretty much just like ferrets, minks. They're very small, scurry creatures. They're furry noodles. They're adorable. But they actually do have some fantastical fantasy elements to them as well. Just kind of a little overview of them. I mean, they kind of share the same species as things like ferrets, I think even wolverines and badgers, which and otters to an extent as well, which also, if you know, badgers are very aggressive, very tough animals. They're very fascinating too. One day I want to talk about those. But weasels are interesting in the regards that they actually have a lot of fantasy-based elements to them, specifically in either Greek or in Japanese culture. But in most cases, though, what's fascinating about these creatures is that they are sort of an anomaly. While creatures like mongoose are actually very amazing for having the ability to be immune to snake venom, and mongoose and snakes being mortal enemies. Weasels, kind of being in the family of like otters, wolverines, a lot, sort of having an interesting sort of dichotomy of animals. They also have sort of interesting folklore. So in Greek culture, they're actually seen as, if you have a weasel in your house, it's seen as bad luck or even evil. Especially if a girl is about to be married. So think of it kind of like seeing a rat in your house. It's just a bad sign. It's thought that, apparently it's thought that an unhappy bride would turn into a weasel. So that's kind of probably where we get our phrases of like, oh, trying to weasel your way out of that, huh? Which actually is really funny when you think about it. It's sort of trying to, sneak your way out of a difficult situation. A lot of that, along with other things, we have in places like, apparently France also believed that weasels were sacred and were not to be killed. In North America, people seem that apparently the weasel is a bad sign, so if it crosses your path, it means you're going to have a speedy death. So think of a weasel kind of like an alternate form of the black cat. So there's a lot of superstition behind a weasel as well. Of course, also being weaselly as being sneevling, conniving, trickery, things like that. But Japanese culture is where it definitely becomes interesting. And if you ever have really partaken in any Japanese culture, media, entertainment, you might have seen weasel-like creatures pop up every so often. And that's because weasel creatures are seen as yokai. Now, yokai are interesting as they have sort of different meanings, but a lot of times they seem to be meant as sort of like strange things happening, strange occurrences, and in a sense kind of like ghosts, monsters, demons, or fantastical creatures that sort of represent a sort of situation. It's kind of a weird and interesting set, but I'll kind of constrain it. So if there's a case of, say, illness going around, a yokai could be explained behind it, being it's a weird situation. Bad luck happening could be yokai. Very specific situations can be yokai. So with a weasel, apparently weasels are very similar to the Japanese folklore of tanuki and kitsune, both of which I've talked about in the past, but a quick rundown. A tanuki is basically a raccoon, and they are believed to have the ability to transform, usually into people, along with kitsune also having the ability to transform and being very fond of tricking people. Usually a kitsune would turn into a attractive woman and trick men, usually stealing stuff from them or worse. But a weasel seems to also have that. But they also seem to have the ability to shapeshift and usually turning into little monks and people. Now, a lot of times weasels have been, again, known for bad luck. They've been known to be tricksters. They have sort of the ability of sort of seeming to be like, I guess, very quick, agile, tricksters, and also sort of messengers of death, or rather being sort of like deadly. So while the Tanuki would be known for being a trickster or being a someone who sort of brings fortune but also transforms, a kitsune is a trickster who likes to steal, so a weasel is a trickster who likes to harm or sort of do just bad things. So they're seen as dangerous. So it's kind of interesting how they sort of there's sort of different levels to that. It's sort of like just sort of to take potential. It's kind of interesting how cultures have the ability to have creatures who do very similar things, but they also can have a lot of different meanings behind what they do. So it's interesting in what they're capable of. Apparently, that when a weasel reaches about 100 years of age, they become yokai. So if a lot of times this happens a lot with Japanese culture, whenever a creature reaches a certain age, they become more powerful, and that's when they're said to become a yokai, or that they're supposed to said to get powers. And that's really interesting too. You know, there's an explanation behind why they're fantastical creatures. You know, a dragon's a dragon because it's dragon. A hippogriff was born a hippogriff. But, you know, a tanuki or a weasel sort of is magical because it lived a really long time and gained powers over time. That's kind of really cool that it explains how they got their names, how they got their powers. And just sort of what they do. Apparently they also really like to chase people around as well. So they were kind of just, you know, really obnoxious, really kind of scary creatures who were potentially deadly as well. But that's just how different cultures can perceive these things. We kind of just perceive them as long noodles who bite, because they do bite, and they kind of hurt. My friend's ferret bit me like a week ago. But regardless, you know, that's just how interesting cultures can be whenever they have their lore, they have their creatures that sort of impact their culture. And whenever a culture has such a rich, you know, full lore behind it, there's always so much interesting things you can find. And eventually some of those things can make their way to other cultures and really influence them pretty well. And it's pretty fascinating. With that being said, it's time for another quick break. But when we come back, we're going to wrap this all up in a nice little bow and talk about more fantastical creatures. I hope you guys enjoy, and we'll be right back.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And thanks once again for sticking around with us today. We've been talking about fantastical pets, the amazing things they're able to do, and just some of the fascinating real-world connections. So when it comes to fantasy, real world, and just sort of mythological creatures, there's always a lot of ins and outs, a lot of technicalities, a lot of just sort of sources to know where something like that comes from. You know, if we look at other creatures that I'm also very fond of, say, cryptids, you know, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, it all depends on the circumstances of where the creatures come from. Is it more recent? Is it lore? Is it something that we can trace the roots of and give a proper explanation? Or is it something more along the lines of this fantastical creature of ancient times that's said to have existed but doesn't? We can't trace the roots of things like a phoenix or a Wendigo, but there are several creatures that have a lot of explanation, or rather have a lot of lore to them that make them into more fantastic creatures. If you want to look at interesting creatures that might have some inspiration, go look at games and series, go look at D&D, and you'll see a lot of creatures that have a lot of lore built behind them, that have come from real world lore, that have come from places. You want to look at a lot of movies, fantasy shows. You got Lord of the Rings, where a lot of fantasy pets and animals come into play. And some of them are just simple, we made it up because it seemed cool. Some of them come from real world lores and places. Quetzalcoatl, a lot of really fascinating creatures that, honestly, some of which I'd be like amazed to see one of, but I more or less find the lore more fascinating than the creature itself. And that's what makes fantasy creatures so fascinating. Sometimes it's just, hey, this thing was a big snake, but it also had wings. Whoa. And there are some things that we can look back and say, was that real? Like, we talk about there being a giant snake, or a giant sloth, or a giant saber-toothed tiger, or whatever. Because for a time, there were these giant mammals that existed. But we as people don't get to see those creatures, but we get to experience them through research or lore, or places that unfortunately we won't really get to see them in person, but we can only sort of speculate and imagine and see where they come into play. And a lot of media has taken fantasy animals and turned them into sort of pets. And it does beg the question, how would we react? Will we be able to do anything with these creatures? Will we be able to domesticate them? Or would there have any real-world applications? Or would they simply just be amazing, unnatural phenomena that occur? I know, there's a fair share of fantastical creatures I'd love to get to see. And I think a lot of series that delve into magical concepts get the chance to really sort of explore and really bring those kind of creatures to light. So I guess that kind of begs the question, what kind of magical creature, what kind of fantastical animal would you like to get to experience time with, get to have as a pet, or even get just to spend an afternoon with? That would definitely be something I hope you guys have an opinion on. If you do, please, feel free to comment on it. Comment on this and just kind of give your opinions and kind of say what your favorite fantastical animal is. And definitely surprise me with what obscure ones you can come up with. I'm thinking in the future I might talk a bit more about some cryptids as well, since those are both sort of fantastical animals, but also possibly real? Don't know. But, I can say for a fact, the sky bison definitely seems like the coolest one to me. If I wanted to talk more about more real world inspired ones, or ones that kind of came out of mythology, there are so many fascinating ones through Japanese and culture that I want to explore more of, but there are so many of them that only time will tell if they'll ever make it to media. It always does fascinate me whenever American media does get to explore some cultures and gets to bring some of that to sort of this time. I think one thing that a company like Disney does have a lot of freedom to do is to get to explore those kind of cultures, and there are some cases where they have interesting instances of the culture and relevance sort of making it into their parks or into their media. I think the fact that the Expedition Everest ride has a Yeti built into it is fascinating, and it's definitely an interesting concept to look into. I would love to see if they introduced more concepts to other pavilions, what kind of interesting things they could do in a Japanese pavilion. There's a lot of interesting creatures out there. I think one thing that was kind of cool that Disney had going for them, they used to have a ride called Maelstrom, which was sort of a tour through Norway and their interesting history, and actually did delve into some of their mythology and interesting creatures and such. And now it's a Frozen ride, but it would have been pretty cool. I never really got the chance to experience this one, but it would have been pretty cool to have more of that going around. Some cultures that have really cool, interesting animals. Look into Central American culture, Aztec culture. They have some of the coolest stuff too, since a lot of it is based mainly out of animals. Jaguars play a big role, but there's a lot of big creatures, a lot of interesting artwork. There's a lot of fascinating ones through there. That doesn't get a lot of representation. I've seen one or two movies and series that have done that, but Fantastic Creatures isn't just for witches and wizards, or isn't just for dragons and wolves. There are a lot of fantasy creatures out there that deserve quite a lot of attention. The main question is, when are they going to get their fair share in the spotlight? That's the biggest question. I know I'm dying to see more fantasy creatures brought to the screen, brought to media. I definitely think dragons are awesome, but we've seen so many of them over time that I'd love to see a new take. I'd love to see something different. I'd love to see a creature that just kind of blows your mind and could be taken into a new cultural experience, but also sort of really pull inspiration from more animals. That's something fascinating that I definitely love whenever whenever culture really delves into the fantasy aspect, and we get to see new types of animals and new beliefs of what is and isn't real, or rather the inspirations of where they come from, because that's just how cool that fantastical creatures can be, is that they really make you kind of look at nature a little bit differently and wonder what could be. But with that being said, you've been listening to the GSMC Pets Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you like what you heard today, please consider subscribing to this podcast and giving us a like. And if you really like what you heard, it wouldn't hurt to leave a comment. It helps us out a lot. And if you really want to follow us, feel free to follow us on social media on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I'd like to thank you all for listening today, and as always, have a great time.
You've been listening to the GSMC Pets Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's podcast.